Good evening and welcome to Incite, presented in partnership with the Vancouver Public Library and the Vancouver Writers Fest. My name is Leslie Hertig and I'm the Artistic Director here at the Vancouver Writers Fest. We'd like to acknowledge that this event takes place on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We're very grateful to be here. This event is Hope in the Face of Loss, featuring authors Liz Levine and Janie Brown in conversation with France Perras. It is a universal topic and one that sooner or later we all grapple with, whether it be through the loss of a loved one or our own impending end. It has not always been a topic that comes easy or with comfort, yet these two authors tonight help us to understand how the end can be a time of hope and even a time of celebration. A big thanks goes out once again tonight to our Incite event partner, the Vancouver Public Library, for their collaboration and support, and also thanks to our government sponsors who make events like this possible. That includes the Government of Canada, the Government of BC, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and CMHC Granville Island. This is the second to last Incite event of the season, but just a reminder that we host events throughout the year, including our digital book club, and information can always be found on our website about upcoming events, including our last Incite event of the year, featuring world-renowned novelist and memoirist Deborah Levy. Also, this is the last call for our Spring Book Club featuring Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Viet Thanh Nguyen in conversation with Scotia Giller Prize winner Ian Williams. That's happening this Sunday, but tickets are still available. Also, we're going to be hosting a special event with Dr. Jen Gunter on June 16th. So tickets for those two events can be found on our website. And mark your calendars because the festival will return in the third week of October, and we'll be letting you know a bit more about that over the next couple of months, what it's going to look like. Soon I'm going to turn things over to our host. France will talk with our guests for a while about their two new books, and then there'll be some time for audience questions, which you can submit using the YouTube chat function. We'll get to as many of those as possible. France Perras is a great friend of the Vancouver Writers Fest and a seasoned moderator on our stages. She is a voice, film, and screen actor and a champion of transformative books that help us to re-envision our lives. Please welcome France to introduce our guests this evening.
Leslie, what a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. It's actually an honor to be here. Welcome to everyone out there in the ether. Welcome to this amazing event, which was slated to happen almost actually over a year ago in person. And of course, we know it has happened. But what a timely, it's a great night to be having this discussion and a great topic to be having now. It is so pertaining. There's been so much loss this year. And perhaps tonight we can have a little bit of hope in the face of that loss. So I'm going to start by introducing Janie Brown, and she's going to do a reading for us, and then we'll proceed to Liz Levine, and I will introduce her as well, and she will do a reading for us, and then we'll go into a discussion. Please feel free. You've got some questions, keep them for you, or let our moderator know, and we will answer those later on in the discussion. Thanks for being here. And so now I would like to invite Janie Brown to join us. Janie is an author, a leader in oncology nursing, the founder and executive director of a nonprofit organization, the Callanish Society, which we can find online at callanish.org, based in Vancouver, Canada, offering retreats and programs for people living with and dying from cancer. Janie is a visionary for new global conversations about living, healing, death, and dying. She began writing about her work in 2011, and in 2018, Radical Acts of Love found its first home at BKS Agency UK and was published by Canongate UK in March 2020. Doubleday Canada followed suit, also publishing in March 2020 at the start of the pandemic. Now, she's been published in Holland, Taiwan, and China. She's written for The Telegraph, The New Statesman, Nursing Standard, and The Scotsman magazine. Janie presents nationally and internationally and writes a widely read blog that you can find at janiebrown.com. Please help me in welcoming Janie Brown.
Oh.
Would you like to do a little reading for us, Janie? Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for that lovely introduction. And to Leslie, obviously, Vancouver Writers Fest and the VPL. It's wonderful to be here a year later. And I so wish, like you said, France, that we could be in person. It would be so lovely to be able to see you all. I know you're out there, and so hi to all the people that I know, and welcome to those I don't. I'd love to, given our theme tonight is hope in the face of loss, I'd like to read a section of this story called The Plunge from my book, Radical Acts of Love. Heather rented a yellow Volkswagen Beetle for the trip to the week-long cancer retreat, a car she had always coveted and never bought for herself. She couldn't justify a new car after her second diagnosis. She thought it would be a waste of money. After a 5-hour flight from Toronto to Vancouver and an 1.5-hour ferry ride to Vancouver Island, she drove 3 hours across the mountains to Tofino, a small surfing town on the Pacific coast. Heather hoped the retreat would help her to find peace, having been told by her oncologist that she had little time left to live. Being a doctor herself, she understood her grim prognosis, from widespread metastases secondary to breast cancer. Heather stepped out of the car at the front door of the lodge. Her wispy blonde hair, thinned from months on chemotherapy, was carefully tucked behind her ears, and her tired gray eyes told the story of her long journey, the arduous road trip on that particular cold, rainy day in mid-January, and the struggles of the past 2 years. The smell of roast chicken greeted us as I pushed open the heavy wooden door into the lounge, with its floor-to-ceiling wood-burning fireplace, overstuffed couches, and picture windows on 3 sides of the room, overlooking the ocean. After breakfast the next morning, I glanced out of the window and noticed 4 people on the beach, far, far below, and wondered if they were guests from the hotel nearby. Looking closer, I recognized Heather, and then Maria, followed by Susan and Betty. Despite the long days of travel, all 4 women had stayed up late the previous night, talking like old friends. They had much in common, including advanced cancer. 2 of the women wore bathing suits. 1 had on leggings and a sports top, and the 4th looked fully clothed other than her bare feet. It dawned on me slowly that 4 women with end-stage cancer, aged 42 to 55, were about to plunge into the white-capped waves of the Pacific Ocean in the middle of January. Holding hands, the tiny cluster of women began to run slowly down the wet sand towards the steely gray Black Sea. I quickly gathered up a few other staff members, including Daphne, our retreat physician. We grabbed a stack of towels and rushed down the path to the beach. Off in the distance, we could see 4 tiny heads appearing and disappearing between the waves of rolling surf. As we got closer to the water's edge, we saw bobbing smiles and heard high-pitched squeals above the sound of the surf. After a few minutes, one by one, the women found solid sand beneath their feet, stood up shakily, and waded their shivering bodies slowly through the surf and back onto the beach. If you can tame your fear of that freezing wild ocean, you can face anything at all, Heather said, looking back over her shoulder at the sea. I didn't know until now, but I traveled almost 5,000 kilometers to do that. She laughed as she held her cold, wet palm to my cheek. Not going in, she asked. Not on your life, I said, then became suddenly aware of my faux pas. Witnessing 4 women who knew they would die soon immerse themselves in the vast winter sea changed me in some indescribable way. Since that day in 1998, and as the promise of my body's impermanence settles in me, I remember those women and I say yes more often to a whim and surprise myself by overcoming a fear with courage. During the brief moments when I wondered if the women might perish in the freezing cold of the plunge that day, it also struck me that those minutes of gleeful abandon to the ocean might possibly have been worth the risk of an untimely end. Heather died 10 weeks after the retreat, and I always wondered if her wholehearted surrender to the ocean that day helped her in her last moments to let go with courage into the vast unknown we know as death. Thank you.
Thank you, Janie. I do love that passage. It's inspired me actually to be dunking in the ocean, just so you know. Yes. So we will go on. If you've got some questions, keep them for the end. For the end, we will get to your questions. In the meantime, we will go to Liz Levine, and then we will have ourselves a discussion. So I should start by introducing Liz Levine, who is also a dear friend. And I should say that perhaps I may be in one or two stories in her books. I have read it a few times. I discovered her voice before it was published. Liz Levine is a producer, transmedia ideator, and writer whose 2 decades of creative contributions span platforms and genres. Liz's produced films include Kira Sedgwick's directorial debut, Story of a Girl, starring Kevin Bacon, for which he was nominated for a DGA, Jason Banker's critically acclaimed Toad Road, and Across My Land, which was nominated for a Palme d'Or at Cannes. Most recently, she executive produced 2 Sentence Horror Stories Season 2 for CW Netflix. Liz has also developed television at Sony TV, CBS TV, TBS, and is currently developing a film with Disney Channel. She completed her Master of Journalism degree at the University of British Columbia and has written for the National Post, The Walrus, Playback Magazine, and the Vancouver Sun. She is a finalist for the Hubert Evans Nonfiction Prize for the book she will be reading from, Nobody Ever Talks About Anything But the End. And now she is currently in her trailer, I do believe, executive producing 2 Sentence Horror Stories Season 3 for CW Netflix with Stage 13. Liz Levine, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, France.
Yes.
And thank you, Leslie and VPL, for having us, and Janie for your beautiful read. I'm going to try and at least come close. I am reading a short story called Easter Bunny from my book, Nobody Ever Talks About Anything But the End. I'm an evidence-based creature at this, the ripe old age of 6. I'm the first of my friends to stop believing in the Easter Bunny, Santa Claus, and the Tooth Fairy. And by the time I am 8, I'm already over the Loch Ness Monster and unicorns. I pride myself on this. I'm 10 when I stopped believing in my sister for the first time. My parents have been divorced for 4 years and are continuously working with each other and all 4 kids to make this as good as possible. But my sister Tamara, age 7 now, is working against the whole plan. Tamara tells my mother stories about my father's dating life. She tells my father stories about my mother's dating life. They all stem from a grain of truth, but to my already attentive ears, they sound like lies. I'm 13 when the high school principal pulls me into her office to ask if my father is touching me and where. He isn't. And so this question is like being asked when the aliens landed or when I last saw the Easter Bunny. I sit stunned in front of her, mortified. It turns out Tamara has told her this not because it's true, but in Tamara's words, because I wanted to see what would happen. As the years go by, the illness gets worse and to my eyes, increasingly obvious. Tamara makes plans with friends we never see, and in this era before Facebook, we can't even confirm that they exist. There's always a boyfriend or 3 that we never meet, an event she's going to that doesn't seem to actually be happening. I'm 22 and driving home to spend Christmas with the family. By this point, Tamara has become obsessed with gift giving. Our gifts are a complex basket filled with myriad things that reflect her understanding of us. This year, I got everything from movie tickets to cool pens and a small black and white ceramic cookie jar with the word shrooms tiled on the front of it. I guess this is my university undergrad reputation. I'm 29 when I fly home to Toronto and learn that Tamara has shaved her head and is telling the whole family that she is dying of cancer. Evidence-based creature that I am, I instantly disbelieve it. Mere blocks away, my friend Judson is actually dying of cancer, so I know what it looks like. And Tamara, she still has her eyebrows and eyelashes. I don't know yet that Tamara's disease gives her an irrational sense of responsibility for any tragedy that she's heard about. I don't connect her lie to my experience yet. So I lose any flicker of remaining belief I might have in unicorns, leprechauns, and magic, and my brother and I decide to take very practical action. We scream at my parents. We try a family intervention. We try and contact her friends. but nothing works. I'm 31 when my brother Lex, the lawyer and politico who counts every black mark as a failure and every success as a resume builder, is given a foster child for Christmas. The small child's name is Maluki, and he lives in a little village somewhere in Africa. My sister has covered his expenses for a year, and this promises to bring Maluki and his village a clean well for drinking water and some basic tools for education. It's almost 3 months past Christmas when my brother's phone rings. It's a representative from Foster Parents Plan Canada. None of Maluki's bills have been paid. There is no fresh water in his village, and he is still starving to death. Lex is officially a delinquent foster dad. Apologetic and mortified beyond belief, my brother hangs up and calls Tamara. She is instantly apologetic. There must be some confusion here. They have my credit card. I'll call and sort it out. You don't need to worry about it. It's late summer when Lex's phone rings again with a representative from Foster Parents Plan Canada on the other line. Maluki is being taken away from my brother. He has failed as a parent and he hasn't even had his own children yet. Maluki will be given to a set of parents that can handle the responsibility and prioritize saving the lives of children. My brother is crushed. Tomorrow's conversations are getting stranger. Now in the modern world of social networks, we can see her friends online and watch their exchanges. She still seems to have friends that don't exist, and she makes plans that never happen. She talks obsessively about a man named Scott Willis. Willis is a world traveler, a well-educated, handsome man living somewhere in Denmark with a name like an American spy. And he loves her, and they are best friends, and he will fly across the world for her if she needs it. And Lex and I, we believe in him about as much as we do in the Easter Bunny. In the last 2 years, Tamara's disease gets so bad that it finally gets named, psychotic with paranoid delusions. Her conversations go from secret meetings with the president and her email being tracked all the way to tinfoil hats and alien invasions. Life becomes a mess of psych wards and doctors and pills, and then she jumps from her 29th floor balcony to her death. Lex and I manage the family through the funeral. He gives the eulogy, and as soon as the service is over, we sneak away out a side door for a cigarette. I'm just absorbing the quiet and trying to wrap my head around all of this before I have to go hug 1,000 strangers. We're standing quietly, hidden around the side of the funeral home when a young man comes towards us. He's well-dressed, and as he extends his hand, I hear the hint of an accent, like someone who's been living somewhere else for a while. I flew in from Copenhagen, he tells us. My name is Scott Willis. And with that, Lex and I have met the Easter Bunny, and I start to believe in magic again.
Thank you. I love that piece so much. Janie, if you'd like to join us, maybe we can have a conversation. Both of those pieces for me are so that example of hope. So tragic, and yet there's hope at the end. And I find that both of your books truly leave us with that sharp and defined sense of hope. Can we talk about that path?
That's the host has to put my video on, apparently.
Oh,
I tried to do it myself.
let's see. That's okay. Let's. Da, 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 da.
Thanks.
You could hear us though, Janie. Yes.
Yeah, I could hear you.
Great. Can we talk about that? Can we talk about the path from darkness to hope? I mean, I think it's touched with vulnerability, but there's so many aspects of it. Can we start on that note? Liz or Janie?
Janie, why don't you speak?
Liz is like, nope, not yet.
That's the same thing. Well, we all had a crash course in how to stay hopeful in this last year and a half. So we've all had to be, find hope, be disappointed. It's just so this is something I think we've all delved deeply into personally. But from my perspective, working with people every day who are diagnosed with a cancer diagnosis, I'm immersed in understanding the concept of hope. And, Emily Dickinson, I have to say, her little piece on hope, and I'll just see if I can remember it. I'll check I can remember. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And that to me is my relationship to hope, because, the Buddhists, and I love a lot of Buddhist teachings, but the Buddhist philosophy is to abandon hope, because then you won't suffer. But I think that we need hope. And I think hope is an unstoppable, irrepressible force. And I think it's a basic human need. And I have learned about hope deeply from the people that I work with. And I have no problem saying to people, I'll stand with you in hope as long as you want me to. I'm also open to have the conversations when the hope is gone. And I think that's the point, isn't it? That that if people say, I always think, we used to say in nursing land that pain is what the person says it is. And I actually think that's true of hope. Like, hope is what the person says it is. And if they want to hope that they'll be at their son's graduation or their daughter's wedding, then I have no problem hoping for miracles. I'm also a pragmatist. So I'm also say, well, yes, I'll do that, but I'll also be open for the hard conversations. And I think hope is really, just something that we all really basically need. And I think it helps us. It helps us to say it's not just about survival. Hope is about life. It's about, that story. It's about yes to life. And I think that's what brings us into a place where we can live with all the challenges that come our way. And when we're hopeless, which is all part of it. I mean, I don't know anyone who can stay hopeful through every moment of life. And when we're hopeless, we need people, we need community, we need nature, we need animals, we need to find a way to, reconnect. And if maybe others can hope for us and with us, we can find our way back. So I think it's something that we all understand deeply and we need each other for. So that's how I would start that.
That's a great way to start it. We have kind of had a crash course on hope this year, haven't we? Yeah. Liz, can you touch on that, or you want to expand on it a little?
I think that I come from a really different place than Janie does. She has really spoken to all of these people in these end of life moments. And my book really examines two losses, both of which were very sudden and stark. So it was less the hope that someone survives or the hope that someone gets through it. And I think maybe more of a personalized, how do you find the magic as a survivor on the other side of losses that look like this? And, I use the word magic a lot, probably because the frame for Janie and I is different. It's not about hoping for an extra 6 months or to make it to a certain date. It's about the magic that life has to offer, which I think is something we've all also experienced in the last year. I think the value we put on things like hugging our parents has really changed in this last year, and adding deep meaning and magic to those moments is sort of who I am as a person and how I drive forward through my life, and a real appreciation of the opportunity and the time that we have here in this space. So for me, it's a constant quest for those magical moments. That's how I keep hope alive.
Oh, beautiful. It's a great way to put it and encapsulate it. And that is what I do hope to encourage the people in the ether to read both books. Because for me, it was also the juxtaposition, as you say, Liz, of the two different ways to hope. Because hope comes in a variety of packages, right? But it gave me a perspective from both your books on, I relearned about how to approach death, how to take it in, whatnot. And obviously through your books, there was a process that you were going through personally. What has been your journey within that? Has that, obviously, it's a long process. Janie, it took you 8 years, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Liz, you were in the couple of years? Not even. I mean, really.
Well, my process was both very slow and very fast, in that the book covers two losses, one which is now 14 or 15 years old. Yeah. But in the time that it happened, that I lost my friend Judson to leukemia, I wrote a lot, and I put that writing in a bottom drawer. And then I think when my sister passed away, as soon as I could see the connection that I felt mental health was a disease like cancer, that I felt these two losses were a great mirror for each other. It came together. Well, I mean, France was essentially by my side while I put it together. It was maybe 3-4 months, to write the whole thing. So it was both very slow and very quick, as the world works.
And kind of essential, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, with a film background, I talk about writing a lot the way we talk about acting, which is if the performer doesn't feel the pain, the sadness, the joy, you're not feeling it through the screen. And I really feel the same way about words we put on the page, even maybe not in the final process, but in the moment that that story happens, I have that feeling. Scott Willis walking around the corner, really, my brother and I had to pick our jaws back up and reattach them to our faces. And that overwhelming magic of this is impossible is a real feeling. And so for the stories in my book that are funny or that are heartbreaking, I laughed or I cried as I put these on the page. And I think that's where the audience gets to laugh and cry as well. It's a very visceral experience for me. I don't know.
Yeah, Janie,
that is for you.
Is it similar? Is it a similar visceral experience for you, the writing?
It was a visceral experience, me reading Liz's book. I'll just say that. I mean, it really comes through, and I really appreciate your book so much. For me, it was a bit of a different, I think the purpose was different. I think it's a therapeutic process, writing, for sure. But for me, I was trying to distill 30 years of experience and I think the underlying goal of this book was to, try to speak a bit about death in a reassuring or consoling way. Now that, of course, doesn't include all the deaths, and like you're speaking to, Liz, the traumatic and sudden deaths. And so my book is really about death from cancer and living with cancer and how to, really live through, especially from the time where you know that the cancer will likely take your life. How do you live those years and months between that point and your death? And those are the people that I see every day, and the people that teach me about, as Liz was speaking, about life. And I've had that teaching from a young age when I started in nursing. So my book is also sort of in a way, Betsy Warland talked about it being a quest book, which I always reject. I thought, no, it's not really about me, this book. But of course, it's always about us, right? And I think that the early stories of me in nursing school and kind of being, with my back flat against the wall as this young man is talking about dying of leukemia, and I had no idea what to say or what to do. So I said nothing, and so, he talked me through his dying. And at that point I thought, this is about life. Like, how are we going to learn how to do this? We all are going to have to learn how to do this in some way. So for me, the book, I think the progression through the book is a bit like that. It's like, how I learned how to talk about it. And then I wanted to share those conversations so that people could have scripts, because I think we're really lost as a culture. We really don't have a clue how to open up these conversations. And I understand that from my life too. So I think that was my goal. It wasn't so much to get my own stories, although there are some very personal stories in the book. But it was to use the stories as real teaching stories. As my Cree friend Maureen said, these are teaching stories. So you can be in the stories, but you're also not, they're universal stories. So that's what I was trying to do, find 20 of those out of a 30-year career and make each one different. And try and sort of, at the end of the day, I wanted people to feel comforted that death through illness can be a natural and, not overly medicalized process. And we as communities can learn and know how to take care of one another, which is really what the radical acts of love means, is that it's a radical act of love to care for the ones we love in their dying. But, as Liz speaks about in her book, in the living, it's how do you keep loving people when you're, pushed against the wall? So I think that's what I see is possible. And I really love the idea of that empowerment of our communities to say, this is an ancient art to look after the people we love at the end of life, in our homes or in hospice or hospitals. But we've lost that. And I think that's very sad that we've created experts, who And we need experts. My goodness, we need experts. But we also need, regular folks like us to say, this is how to do it. So I think I'm interested in getting back to those roots, and the people that I live and work with are the same. They say, we can do this and learn how to do this better. So
it's an exciting time. I find your books are so apropos, and it's crazy that they came out last year, and they're so timely for now. And at the same time, they were before the curve. So I wish, everybody had started reading them, because you've started a pathway for this important conversation. How do we continue the conversation? I mean, these books for me I find them, they're my Bibles. They are my Bibles in different ways, where I get the humor and the so tragic and so real and so visceral. And at the same time, the accompaniment of this is teaching me to accompany someone in death and living, right? So how do we continue that conversation? I mean, I think it's starting. Don't we have, a national conversation happening with Dying with Dignity called grief literacy? I think there's been a lot of grief literacy spoken about. There's a great team in Toronto called Being Here Human. There's a conversation that is happening. Was it happening before the pandemic? Is it even more? Is there more of a spotlight now?
Well, I could just add the palliative hospice community have been trying to do this for a long time. Of course, that's a very small percentage of deaths, people die in hospice or palliative care. So the conversation has just gone, it's opened up. And so I'm, very interested in that. But I still think there's, even with the pandemic, and even with, mortality, as I say, came into everyone's living room, literally, and there's been so much loss and so much grief, we're still ill-equipped, and I'm with you, like, how do we keep this moving? And I think we have to be braver. I think we have to be braver to, there's an interesting, and we'll talk maybe a bit about this because of when we published, Liz, that, there was a moment where it was, I think there was a potential to have our books, there. And I found, I don't know if you did, Liz, there was still that cultural taboo of, no, I'm not sure your book right now, maybe later, but right now, no. So I came up against this, which is really the cultural taboo of, no, let's not talk about it, even though it's in my living room and I might want to talk about this. So I think it's interesting. I'm with you. I really think we need to keep opening up and having these very important personal conversations with ourselves about death, first of all. I mean, I still talk to many people in their 80s who haven't got a will and are very sick with cancer, and they haven't talked to the people they love about anything, advanced directives, so this is our time, and this is happening today. So we have a long ways to go, but I'm hopeful about it, that we can keep the conversations. Yeah. Liz, what about you?
Well, I mean, I hear a lot of what you say. I think we're so sanitized around death in North America. It is, I think, so scary to people who have not touched it or have touched it, but maybe not fully enough, that it really gets pushed aside. And, one of the first very short stories in my book, I believe under A for action, is just those single sentence, this whole book is a verb for me. It is the act of being vulnerable and being present and being, people say of the book all the time, this was brave, which it doesn't feel like that on the inside for me, but I do understand the external look at that, which is that I'm saying things people are afraid to say. And I'm also thinking things people are afraid to think. And I think when we talk about sanitizing culture, we're not just talking about what gets verbalized, we're actually talking about thought patterns and behavior that we really have an ability to push ideas aside. And I hope that this is the beginning of the conversation, but outside of that palliative care kind of space, I'm not sure that that's true. I, like you, Janie, heard a lot in COVID, but life's so depressing right now that I can't read this book. And my response is the book's funny. Like, there are my sister bought my brother a foster child that never, like, there is comedy in this because this is life and death is part of life, and we don't talk about it that way. There's no holistic dialogue that includes death in the conversation about our lives, and yet it is literally the single thing that every single person on the planet has in common. And it's always quite shocking to me that we are in this sanitized place. So I am hopeful because I believe in magic, but I am also skeptical because I am a producer and because I think that there are mental walls up here that people just, I really can't tell you the number of people who say, I've bought your book and it sits on a shelf. I'm afraid to read it.
Yeah, I've given it to quite a few people who have had losses and they've said exactly the same thing. And I wish I'm trying to educate myself. I want to learn. I'm well, lucky, not lucky. I've lived some losses as well, which have permitted me to go to the other side. Is that part of it? Is that part of, we need to have lived a huge loss in order to be able to have conversation about it? Like, I always wonder, is that part of the deal?
I think those people are the leaders of the conversation. I think that anyone can participate in it, but I think, for my experience, my losses were, a sibling at the age of 4 and then a love of my life in my 20s. And so many of my peers had only lost sort of pets and grandparents at the point that I had been that close to a body that was actually taking its last breath. And so I'm not afraid to talk about it. And I think those big tragic moments kind of have you step over the fear, and those people we have to lead the conversation or it won't be had, I think.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is true, that I remember when my father was diagnosed with a brain tumor and had sort of 13 weeks, he was at 67, so he was a young man, 13 weeks from diagnosis to death. And I remember that moment, like we all do, when the phone call came from my mom. And I remember thinking, my life has changed forever. And I didn't know what that meant then. I was in my 30s, but it was the most significant death to me at that point. I've had grandparents die, but that was my most significant death. And it did. I mean, how can it not change you? So I think of course these experiences, and then what we choose to do with those experiences, how do we open up to them, as you're speaking about, Liz, or do you just shut them down? And you see people who are traumatized by the losses in their family and haven't known how to get help or haven't known how to really open up. And I think so it's what we do with our losses and how we, and sometimes a loss from an early age, it takes us 20 years to get there. And then we do some, it opens up. It can happen in a moment. Something happens and there it is, all the grief, like you were speaking about your that loss in in your 20s. It's like it's very it's important. But what's happened because of what we're talking about around death in our culture is that people can be 60 and 70 and never have seen anyone die. And so what does that do? It creates the terror. I mean, the fear is the problem, because actually if you're with someone who's dying a peaceful death and they have good care and they've got symptoms managed, it's not scary if if you can see it and be with it and be supported in it. And I think that's the message really, is that if you haven't seen it, all you ever see is, or hear about it, the traumatic deaths. And I think COVID in a way has really deepened fear for a lot of people around, infectious disease is a very different story. So I think the fear of death is just like gone through the roof because of these, awful stories we're hearing. We're not hearing, as always, in the sense the stories of people who got through. I had an 89-year-old client who got COVID and went to hospital, and she told me the whole story. And, she said that, yeah, I was on the verge. They were talking about ICU. And then she had this very interesting moment where she realized that, I can feel the dark. That's how she described it. I can feel the darkness coming. And she just said, no way, And again, this is an interesting subject. Do we have the will? Well, I wish we did. There's so many people who wish had the will to be able to stop something that they don't want to be happening. But she turned back, she was in hospital for 10 days, got home. So, so death is, again, we've got lots of healing to do, I think, from what's happening and the losses and the deaths and the way that we haven't been able to be with loved ones in hospital. And it's really tragic what's happened. And I think there's lots and lots of healing. And I hope that will open our communities to say, we really need to heal together through this, this time that we are still living in here in Canada, for sure.
We do. How do we address those fears even? How do we, right? I mean, it's through conversation, absolutely, I believe, as we continue to do this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, death is a little bit like, off Janie's last comment, a dark room. And the hope is that books like this are turning on the light. Because when you can see it, it is less scary.
Yeah.
I think it's like a very relevant point, Janie, and I think it is in our lack of dialogue, in the darkness of that room, in the silence of fear, that it just becomes ever deeper a black hole that we can't see the bottom of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think we have to start really young with our kids and our grandkids, because they're the ones who are curious about death right off the bat. I mean, they're the ones who say, what just happened to the dog? And so if we come to that with anxiety and fear, how are they going to learn? So I think we have to go really young. And I think that's happening, of course, in a lot of families where parents are using that opportunity to start the education right then, because it's kids grow up with frightened parents. Guess what's going to happen? They're going to be frightened adults as well.
That's great.
And they're not frightened by nature. They're full of joy. I think about the story in my book with my little niece and my brother explaining on the way to the cemetery that our sister has died, like the dog, like Poppy. And the kids burst out of the car and are like, it's like Poppy. We're going to put flowers on the grave like Poppy, like we did for the dog. And so there is something so naturally accepting in children that I think that's also a very sage point, Janie, that it is the little ones that will naturalize this conversation for all of us, maybe.
Will hopefully take away the fear, right?
Yeah.
They will show us the joy in the moments. Continuing, I've got a question for Janie, continuing with how best we deal with the hard stuff. The question comes from Tara. How can we best be with people who know they're dying? What are the best things to say and do? And what should perhaps not be said or done?
Well, that's a
big one. It's a big one.
First thing I'd say is say less than more, because trying to find words for a kind of an experience that is, it's hard for us to put words on someone else's experience. So if you're with someone who's dying, this is where the courage comes in. I think the courage is to be curious and ask the questions. What's happening? Like, are you afraid, or what's going on? Of course, if people don't want to talk about it, they'll shut it down immediately. So I think it's really, again, we think we should know, we think we should be experts, like, oh, I need to know what to say. But I think we can start by being curious if we don't know. And then I think that what people say to me so often is don't try and give kind of, simplistic and pat kind of solutions and generalize, because each person's experience is totally different. So I think we tend to, oh, well, then dying people must be this or that. And of course, I work with people every day who, they might say they're dying, but to me, they're living, because we're really living, pragmatically till the very last breath. But they're also acknowledging that they're turning toward that death is in the vicinity, wherever that is, closer or further away. So I think, again, it depends on what stage that people are at with that question. So, if people are very close to the end of life, I think that it depends on the person. And I always say follow their lead. So there can be hilarity and a lot of joy. And, there are families I've walked into the room expecting kind of doom and gloom, and there's singing happening, or the opposite. I think that this family is going to be, full of joy and acceptance, and they're terrified. So you kind of have to, what I, in a hypnosis term, mirror and pace. So you mirror what you see in front of you. So don't walk into a very quiet room and just be like, ah, like that, you know, walk into a quiet room and be quiet. I mean, this sounds so simplistic, but I really mean it, you know, because we can think our job is to jolly it up or to calm it down, and really our job is to match and mirror what's happening. And then you're in the party. I mean, you're really there with people in a very true and genuine way by saying, I'm here, you know, trying to be with people as they are. And I think that's probably the biggest thing, not to try and be too like make, you know, there's so many, there's a group of our young adults, and some of them are probably listening, but they've got this coffee table book idea where, you know, all the sayings that, and I'm sure you've heard many of this, you know, in grief, it's the same, you know, all the sayings that people, and they're just ridiculous and they're so unhelpful. So don't try and be clever, just kind of be yourself. And people really want you to be yourself. I think it's, you know, don't be different just because the person's at the end of life. I think people want to be themselves, and they are themselves in so many ways, right? Their bodies are doing something, but they're still the same person. So
I really love that, hearing the match and mirror. It really makes sense to me. I've also heard a lot of, if you don't know what to say, it's okay. You don't actually have to say anything.
Right, exactly. I think
that's whole space.
Yes. So listening, you know, listening is just so important.
Is there, if I can bounce it back to Liz a little bit, is there something, because you did live something so tragic with Judson, and through all your stories you tell us about him dying of cancer, is there something you wish you had said or wish you had done? Is there something that, I mean, because you did everything right in terms of bringing puppies and bringing, like, the stories are amazing. But
I think probably there's something in there that I may have wanted to say, but also we were so young. I was so uneducated about death. I knew this person deeply and intimately. And at the end of the day, all I could do was be us. And so we were. And so we smuggled puppies into hospitals and marijuana across the country, and snuck out the window and sat on the roof and smoked the joints. And we were so used to being us that I think that didn't change just because of the big scary word, cancer.
Yeah.
And I feel really actually lucky that is how we spent, you know, the last of our time together.
Yeah, which is beautiful. It's really, you did match and mirror in some way, shape, or form, right?
Because I think, again, like as young people, it's natural. It's that it gets beaten out of us with fear and with sanitization and with the way that what is culturally appropriate. You know, I talk about my mother on the day of Judson's funeral saying, settle down, like, this is not a moment to laugh. Don't walk around at the cemetery like your boots are making lots of crunching noises in the snow. And so we're actually taught the opposite of the advice that Janie's really giving
us.
And thankfully, at the moment that Judson got sick, and it was so quick, it was somewhere between 8 and 10 weeks from diagnosis to death, that there was just nothing to do but show up and be ourselves. And I think there's a real blessing for me in that
gift. Yeah. Can we talk a bit? I'm going to go to another question in a minute, but I wanted to talk, I mean, we've spanned a variety of things, but the structure of both of your books is so different and yet so pertaining to what you've written. Can we touch on that a bit? Can you talk about your decisions to how to structure it? I mean, Liz's is an alphabet and has that true arc, and Janie's is their personal stories. They're stories of other people, but they're truly through you, and they get more and more personal, I find, through your journey. We take a journey with you. Can we touch on that a bit?
Well, I think structure is an interesting thing. Do you want to?
It is. Was it a decision at the start? Like, was that the first decision? Did it come later?
Well, Liz, you go. I think your structure is really interesting.
It is.
I think a couple things. I write in short bursts because this is how life happens to us. And I'm not really interested in filling in the gaps in between. So I came to this with a style. And, Easter Bunny was picked up, the piece I read today, by the Walrus as a standalone short story. So, when that moment sort of came that a lit agent called and said, this is a great piece, is there a book here? What I actually had was a jar of jelly beans. I had all of these different moments and just thought about how we organize things. And there's really a limited number of organizational principles on the planet. Numerical, thematic, alphabetical, which is what I chose to go with. So the alphabet was an organizational structure, but ultimately in choosing what went where on the page, given that it is nonlinear in every form, for me, the structure was about reflecting the process of grief. That sometimes the book is hard and it's deep and it's sad, and at the moment you think it's maybe too hard to turn the page, it's light and it's funny. And this is how we move through grief. We go from tears to laughter in a moment that feels uncontrollable and undefinable. And I really wanted the book to have that visceral sense. It was amazing, Janie, to hear you say today, it felt like that, because as a sort of multi-platform content creator whose agenda was never to be an author or specifically to only write, for me, creating content is about allowing somebody to live my experience. Mm-hmm. So the structure of this book feels like a ride. You get in at the beginning, and if I'm going uphill, you're going uphill. And if I'm going in a loop-de-loop, so are you. And I think that was really the agenda for me as all of the alphabetical pieces began to come together.
It's great. It really works.
And I think that, that's interesting that neither of us set out to be authors. And I was interviewed by somebody who said, you're the first person I've actually talked to who didn't want to be an author from an early age in life, so we come at this through a different path. So I'm sure structure, the people who know a lot about structure kind of have it ahead of time. But for me also, the structure had to appear. And I think how I started was that there's 4 sections, and in the first, there's 5 or 6 stories in each section. And the first section, I really wanted to be like kind of a how it could be if we could open up to death. And those stories are all about what happens if you can, open up to your fear and work with your fear. And so I really wanted that to be kind of okay, we could maybe get to this. And I really loved that part. And then the second one was not always like that. There's so many people who've had deaths that are difficult, unresolved. It's not always, as we know, neat and tidy. And you can't always have the death that you hope you will have or that your family will have. So I wanted to make sure it was like it's all these good stories or the good death. It's not like that. So I wanted the stories of what do you do when you never got to talk to your loved one and you really wanted to, and they were shut down. And I mean, these are very common stories. So I wanted people to know, okay, and then you grieve differently, and you grieve with that longing and wish and regret. So of course, preventing regret is one of the themes in the book. Can we prevent regret? If we do, how do we do that? Or if we have regret, how do we live with it? And then the third part of the book is a very, I think the hardest part of the book, which is really the people that choose, and these are many people in my community, the Callanish Society community in Vancouver, they're people who want to do the work, and they say, I want to figure out, how do I resolve that early loss early in my life? I don't want to go to my grave having not grieved that death. And what do I do if I had abuse in my early life, or I lived in a very dysfunctional family? How do I settle that? We can't get over things. I use the word settle because I think it's almost the best we can do. We can learn to forgive behavior, but there's some people we can never learn to forgive. We can't forgive. So how do you do that at the end of life? And I've learned so much from the people that I work with to say, I want to confront this. And we've learned as we went along, okay, well, we'll figure out how to do that. How do we talk to a family member that, created so much grief? So that section's very difficult. And some people have said that's too hard, that section, it takes them to their own center, perhaps, of unresolved things. And then the last section is kind of what I think of as the mystery, and the unexpected that happens. And I think, thank goodness, we have, those, Liz calls them magic moments, but they're so essential to, that we can be surprised. We think of the future, the unknown, as terrifying, but actually there's a lot of surprise and delight in the future and unknown that I always say, well, what about that? Can we think about? And those stories are really about things that have happened that are like that, that bring a lot of surprise and delight. And so it brings a balance, I think, to the hard work and the hard experiences, that dying's not easy. So it's, but it can be balanced in a way with how we approach it.
Yeah, it can be balanced, right? And it can also, well, I wish we could face fear with such magic and delight. If only we could, or if only we could put somewhere the message that fear can be, tackled with curiosity, magic, and delight sometimes, or it can be squashed by, shall we say. You both touched on grief in your structure and spoke about grief in your book. And I've got a question that I'd like to tackle, if you're okay with that. Thank you for talking about your structure. To tie that up, beautiful. How do you respond to people who believe that there's a set amount of time that one can grieve, and then they seem to be annoyed when that period is longer or presents in non-traditional ways? It's a great question. Are there, there's a variety of answers, I'm sure, but grief is a huge topic, and it's so personal and so subjective. Mm-hmm. Janie, can you respond to that a bit?
Well, I think grief lasts as long as a piece of string. Like it isn't. You can't define it in time frame. So what I love is the people who talk about long-lasting relationships, really, that because that quote, death is the end of a life but not a relationship, I think is true. It can go on being a very difficult relationship for the rest of your life, even after the person's died. So we do have ongoing relationships, and I think grief is learning to live with the loss and to actually learn about your own grief. What's grief to me? People say, well, I know I'm on the edge of feeling really sad when I get really grumpy or cranky, or I'm just like, and that's really about grief. So each person grieves differently. And I think the whole thing of 1 year, you should be this and that, and there's so many books that say, you recover and get over it. And you don't really, you learn to live with it. And I think that's how I see it. It's a long lasting relationship. And it gets, over time, things change. They're not so intense. At the beginning, there's a very specific, really, structure to grief, where you've got to really understand the death's happened and you have to come to terms with that. And then there's a whole period of time that's very messy and has a lot, and people often think they're going to be much worse at the beginning. They're going to be a mess and they can't cope, which is not what grief is. It's moments of not coping and moments of falling apart. And then there's moments where people feel guilty because they actually feel okay. And then there's a time where there's all the stuff you have to work through of what happened and the moments and your own relationship to that and your own regrets and it's complicated, but that can go on for, a long time. And then, the third phase is sort of what they call relearning your world without that person in it. And I think that's also a kind of a phase of grieving, but you couldn't put time limits. You can say 2 or 3 months for that first phase where you're in shock and you're trying to, but with a sudden death, it's longer. So I think it's a complicated thing, but I don't think any recipes for grief are helpful. And I don't think we should expect anything of people. We hear people talk about their, they should get the house tidied up of the person's belongings. And then I say, well, you just let it be for as long as it, and then our instincts will be to move the belongings at some point or not. So I always say grief is a very visceral experience too. And I think I try and help people to say, follow the instincts you have. If you want to stay in the same house, forever, or if you want to move, like trust yourself. And I think that's the biggest thing, because it is so different. You can't say, well, so-and-so, got married 6 months later, and I can't imagine ever doing that again. It's like, we're so different. So That's a very roundabout way of answering the question. Maybe Liz.
No, I think it's a fantastic way to answer it. Liz, do you have any responses?
Maybe two. Yes. One, the words that I will never forget from my mother: the pain never lessens, it just happens less often.
Yeah.
So that loss is always real. And then I think for the audience member that kind of put forth that question, my response is, you'll put it down when it's too heavy for you to carry. And so are you in touch with your mental health, with your physical health, with how you feel? And are you at a place that you're ready to put that down? And do you need some help to do that? Because there are places, but that is your inner voice. And the idea that you are ready to do that in 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, 1 decade, not for us to say. It really, is a process that has to be internal. Mm-hmm. Is that fair, Janie?
Yeah, I'm with you.
I think that's fantastic. And it's a great way to put it. We just don't trust ourselves in the process, do we? We're not taught how to trust ourselves in the process.
Mm-hmm. Especially if it's never happened to us before. So you have to learn what can you turn to that's helpful? What do you turn to that's unhelpful? I mean, it has to really be your own experience that you learn. So it's hard. Grief is really, really, and again, a very kind of invisible thing in life, I think. We hide it away in our culture too. Those cultures where people dress in black for a year and everyone knows you're mourning. Like there's something about that that's actually quite beautiful and comforting to think of. Everyone around me knows. So I think that we've just, we hide it away. And I feel badly for that, because there's so many people who really do want to keep telling the stories of their family member who's died. And people think, oh, I shouldn't ask, or I shouldn't intrude, and people want to. I mean, it's like, over time it becomes quieter and quieter around them, that people don't want to talk, or they think it's upsetting to talk about. So I think that's quite sad, really, that we hide it away so much, when again, it's a universal experience for all of us.
I would just add that thus the title of my book.
Yeah.
Oh, they died. Oh, they died of cancer. Oh, they died by suicide. Oh, they died. And that's where the conversation ends. Nobody ever talks about anything but the end. Mm-hmm. And the ability to tell those stories and bring those people forward and have them present with you is challenging in this culture, for sure.
Mm-hmm. We're not really allowed, are we? To bring them with us.
Right.
As you were saying, Janie, that you really did feel when the books were about to come out before pandemic times, you really felt that there was going to be some kind of pushback. Mm-hmm. And it was present, wasn't it?
Yeah, there was pushback. I think there was pushback, because it was like, not now. It was kind of the same thing. Not now. I think, well, not in a global pandemic. Well, isn't this the time?
If not now, when?
When? I know. So it's perfect that we're having it now, as we all become emissaries of death. I mean, that's me, but anyway. Can I ask another question? This is for Liz. Do you have any advice on how best we can support people who have the experience of a loved one dying by suicide? What is helpful to say and what isn't?
I think that the answer really mirrors a lot of what Janie was saying about how you step into that room around death. I think it is about mirroring. And, I also think it's about some of the semantics of language. So I personally have dropped the use of the word committed. Yeah. We commit murder and we commit bank robberies, and we don't commit suicide. We die by suicide. It is a disease. And so I think it exists in the small things. there is a story in my book about the day my sister died.
There sure is. Would you like to talk about it, Liz?
I would, Fran.
Yeah, you're allowed. It's perfect that this question was answered. It was asked, Liz. I read it. I was reading it, and I'm like, I should be reading this question.
It happened. I went to France's house within sort of the hour of it happening, and France opened the door, and the first words out of her mouth were, "At least my sister would have called me first." And yet, as you can all tell, I still like France very much, and she still likes me. And I, really in retrospect and digesting it, I felt the authenticity of that response. I felt France's fear. I felt how terrible she felt for me and how real her grief was. And instead of giving me a platitude and a condolence that I could have found on a Hallmark card, this is somebody who just was real. And real doesn't always mean right, but it ultimately creates correct. But it ultimately creates a very safe place where that the responses are going to be authentic. And everyone's going to be different. And I think going with that mirror theory and really understanding that a death by suicide is a death by disease.
So beautifully said.
Yeah. I think it's really important that you don't ask, because often the first question is how. And I think that's a really, really painful question, because we're curious. And I think that's what it comes across as too. I just want to know. It's kind of like a sensational, and it's just the hardest thing for people to hear. I don't know if you agree with that, Liz, but I just think it's, you may want to talk about that, but it shouldn't be the first thing. And I don't think you should be asked about that personally. I think that's a very
I agree. And I think it's part of the disease issue too, because how did you die of cancer? Well, some people die of an infection. Sometimes the chemo kills them. Sometimes there are actually 100 ways to die from cancer, the way that there are 100 ways to die from suicide. So it is part of the way that suicide has been framed societally, that there is this strange obsession with the how. I think you're absolutely right, Janie. And I think, again, it's part of that mirroring. Don't ask, just create space. Creating space allows people to tell. And as soon as they start telling, you have a better sense of where they want to go, and you can sort of further open up in the direction that they're leaning.
That's great. I think that's the top one, Janie. Don't ask how. Thank you for stating that.
One more thing. I had a very, very dear friend who did choose to take her own life. And I think that it's so complicated. And I think that the sense of, you go through a time where you think, what could I have done? Could I have done something different? And I think we all go through that when someone we love does that. But was there more I could have done? And I think that's I think it's a normal thing to go through that. But I think at the end of the day, you have to see it as a long process of illness that usually can end in suicide. And it really helps me to understand it that way too. So it's not like, oh, something I didn't do or something I should have done. It's just not so personal as that. And there can be regrets that are real for sure. I mean, I think that's, again, a normal part of grieving, is to think, oh, if only I hadn't. But when it comes to suicide and feeling I should have been able to stop it, I think that's a really risky territory that doesn't really take us anywhere good, other than to be blaming of ourselves. Yeah.
It's not the place we should be, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no further questions, and I'm going to kind of start wrapping it up. I'm touched and honored that you would have both been present and vulnerable in sharing your points of view and your ideas with us, and how important this conversation is, and that we do need to continue it. And may it just be the beginning. Are there anything more that you'd love to leave our audience in the ether out there with? Any parting words, anything that you'd like to share that we didn't talk about, or that's really close to your heart? Is there something else that you'd like to add? You're like, nope.
I mean, I will just play off Janie's words,
Yeah.
which is that we are
Yeah.
really living until we take that final breath. And I think whether you are the person struggling with a diagnosis and kind of charting your own course towards the end of your life, or whether you are the person left behind and in grief, the answer is you get to do this once. Enjoy your life. You know, that is my real message to point finale on this conversation.
Well, we spend so much life developing such a beautiful life. Why can't we spend so much life developing a beautiful death? Right?
Can I tell a quick story to add by way of?
I would love that. Yes,
I
please.
just come out of an amazing, just an incredible high point with a young woman, Lise Berube, who may be listening or not. I'm not sure if she's on the call tonight. She might be. But she's a young woman living with stage 4 cancer. She has 2 little kids, 5 and 7. And she decided she was going to run a marathon, having just completed brain radiation. Of course, running a marathon to any of us is like, what? And that was a year ago, just when the pandemic broke. And she did that with a friend, Grace Lore, and she raised $65,000 for our charity. And then this March, she said, I want to do it again, but I want anyone who wants to participate in what we called Move Because You Can, which is sort of the message that you're talking to, you know, Liz. There's a message on the back of the t-shirt that says, there will come a day when you cannot do this. This is not that day. And so we had 300 people join in this campaign from across the country, just doing 5K walks or 5K runs, and it was just an incredible, it was just this feeling that, you know, it's what we always focus on what we can't do and the problems. I think that's come again so much in this pandemic. You know, there's so many things that are scary and worrying, but what can we do? And I think that's just the message I've taken from Lisa and all the friends who were part of this. This just happened on May the 8th, and I rode 90 kilometers on a bike, and, you know, we all just joined in, and they raised an amazing amount of money. And it was sort of like in the middle of a pandemic, we were doing these things. So again, like you, Liz, I think, you know, there's so much that's possible, you know, even when things are very difficult. And the people who are struggling, we just bring them along with us and don't forget them, you know, because there's so many people. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, people were saying, oh, it's so wonderful. I'm having a personal retreat and this is such a great time. And I'm thinking, are you serious? You know, so, you know, bring along the people who are struggling, and we've got to stick together through all of this. So that would be my message.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. And it ties into kind of this last question, if possible, of, you know, how do we grieve in these times when we can't have the ceremonies? Well, we find our ways to try and grab each other together, don't we?
Yeah.
Try and reach each other. Do we try and do rituals? Do we, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to do something to honor the people. And, you know, a lot of people are waiting. And I'm seeing now more people saying, well, we can't wait, so we're going to do something online, even though I'd rather not. And I've seen some very beautiful ceremonies online, and there's people who are meeting outside, especially now. And I think we're having to be very creative, and I think it's working. You know, we just have to do it differently, which is not so bad for us to try and think out of the box.
Yeah. But let us continue to be creative and joyful and hopefully magical in these trying times, right? Let us continue to talk and continue this conversation. I'm really, really touched that I got to spend this last little bit with you guys. I don't know what else to say. I'm kind of a little speechless. I'm left in magical land, in trying to face fears that we all have, in talking will get us through those fears, in trying to shine light into those dark corners, and to really keep talking to our youngins who have the joy, bring them around and make sure they teach us to be joyful and to live our lives, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us, Liz. Thank you for joining us, Janie. I'm a little speechless, I won't lie.
Thanks, France.
Thank you.
Nice to be with you again.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much, France. Thank you so much for your expert moderation this evening. And Janie and Liz, yes, I know you can't see the wonderful comments that are coming in on the YouTube chat right now. We'll share those with you later. But I think I'm speaking for our whole audience, as well as I know the staff behind the scenes who've been madly messaging. What a beautiful event this has been. How really joyful, in fact, it has been. And we thank you all very much for that, and for teaching us some ways that we can move forward with loved ones, and giving us some hope for the future too. I wish you all very well. Be healthy, stay well, and thank you. Hope to see
Thanks,
you again.
Leslie.
Maybe in person next time.
Exactly. Cross our fingers.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good night for now.
Night for now.
Bye.